As someone who loved Doom 2016 but didn't really enjoy Doom Eternal, I was on the fence about trying Doom The Dark Ages. But between Baldur's Gate 3 sessions, I decided to give it a go. And honestly, some parts really surprised me in a good way. Others, not so much. Here's the opinion of a Baldur's Gate 3 addict on Doom The Dark Ages. Let's start with what's traditionally Doom's weakest stat roll, story. If you're coming in expecting deep lore, twists, or emotionally rich characters, you might want to realign those expectations. Doom, The Dark Ages does attempt to deliver more narrative than its predecessors, and to its credit, the presentation is cinematic and stylish, but in terms of actual storytelling, it's serviceable at best. There's a big bad with a typical world-ending plan, factions clashing, and Doomguy doing exactly what you'd expect him to do. Turn everything in his path into flaming chunks of regret. Beyond that, the game keeps the story pretty light. There are characters and setups that feel like they should matter more, but a lot of it fades into the background between missions. What's odd is how front-loaded the narrative feels. There's a burst of setup early on, then long stretches of gameplay with minimal cutscenes or context, and finally a rush of story again at the end. It's not bad, but it definitely feels uneven. Let's not forget one of the biggest W, performance. This game is a straight-up showcase of what the engine can pull off when it's firing on all cylinders. No shader, pre-compilation screens, barely any load times, zero stutter, just pure, uninterrupted demon genocide. I played this on a beefed-up RTX 4090 rig with 64 gigabytes of RAM and all the latest drivers, so yeah, I brought a sledgehammer to a sword fight. But still, when a modern game boots instantly and runs smoother than Michael Jackson's moonwalk, that deserves applause. Especially when the rest of the PC gaming world is out here stuttering like it's part of the immersion. Now, your mileage may vary. PC gaming is unpredictable like that. But in my case, this was one of the cleanest AAA launches I've played in a while. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room, parrying. At this point, I'm convinced every modern game dev team has a checklist that starts with, can we add a parry? Turn-based? Parry. FPS? Parry. Dating sim? Probably has one too. It's like we're all living inside that 2024 anime, I parry everything, where the protagonist's entire skill tree is just parry. But memes aside, Doom the Dark Ages actually makes parrying feel like a core mechanic, and surprisingly, it works. Mostly. I was skeptical at first. Doom's all about raw aggression and staying on the offensive, so tying so much of the combat to timing-based defense felt like it might slow things down. And yeah, there's a lot of parrying here. Every enemy has some attack you can deflect, and your melee cooldowns rely on parry success. It's not optional, it's baked into the flow. But here's the issue. The parry itself has this slightly delayed startup and a pretty generous timing window, which makes it feel less like a crisp skill check and more like early prediction. Add to that the slow-mo effect that plays every time you land one. It looks cool the first dozen times, but when you're in a room full of enemies, the constant stop-start effect starts messing with your timing more than helping. It's not bad. In fact, it's kind of satisfying when it clicks, but it doesn't always feel tight. Let's talk about the demons, or more specifically, how they feel this time around. Doom. The Dark Ages has roughly the same enemy count as Eternal, and yes, many familiar faces return, but despite that, the variety feels thinner here, and a lot of that comes down to how the new combat design leans heavily into parrying. In Doom Eternal, people were divided over the weapon counter system, where you had to use specific guns or skills to take down certain enemies efficiently. Some felt it made fights too mechanical, more like solving a checklist than reacting freely. They just replaced guns with the shield. Now, instead of matching the right weapon to the right demon, you're expected to parry almost everything. Enemy has armor? Parry. Enemy is charging? Parry. Enemy is halfway across the battlefield and somehow still landing hits? Guess what? Parry. The shield becomes your answer to nearly every threat, and while it's functional, it also flattens the variety in how you approach encounters. Most enemies have different animations and behaviors, but your response rarely changes. The removal of dodging as a defensive tool makes things even more one-note, and the lack of classic support demons like Archviles or Carcasses means fewer disruptions to shake up the flow. On top of that, combat stretches longer than it should because of the new leader mechanic. You'll often be forced to clear out waves of tough enemies just to unlock the chance to fight a boss tier leader demon. And when that loop keeps cycling with the same handful of parry heavy enemies showing up repeatedly, it starts to lose its edge. The combat is still intense, still fun, but the encounters don't evolve as much as they used to, and when the main solution is always use your shield, that intensity starts to feel less exciting and more exhausting. With all the emphasis on parrying in the game's core combat, you'd expect some standout boss fights that lean into that mechanic, but oddly enough, most of the bosses don't take advantage of it at all. Out of the 7 major boss encounters, a good chunk of them feel more like heavily armored tutorials, introducing enemy types that eventually become regulars. One boss is a cinematic set piece more than a fight, and while there are a couple of standout battles toward the end, they feel clumped together instead of spread throughout the campaign. It's not that the bosses are bad, they're just surprisingly underwhelming, especially compared to what Doom Eternal pulled off. Instead of elevating the gameplay, many of them just pass by without leaving much of an impression. Then there's the music. On its own, it slaps. Lots of high-energy, metal-driven bangers that amp you up in combat. But after a while, it starts to blend together. Unlike the previous Doom games that mixed in ambient, eerie, or experimental sounds between the heavy riffs, this one stays in all-metal all-the-time mode. It works in the moment, but it doesn't leave the same lasting impact or variety as before. And finally, no glory kills, or at least barely any. They technically exist, but they're so dialed back you might forget they're even part of the combat system. Most feel limited to scripted animations, and outside of a few finishing moves on big targets, the signature Doom-style takedowns are noticeably absent. Melee hits still feel satisfying and brutal, but the lack of glory kills takes away that rhythmic flow the last 2 games nailed so well. At the end of the day, Doom: The Dark Ages is still Doom, and there's really nothing else like it out there. The only competition Doom has is Doom itself. And while this entry has a few quirks that might not land for everyone, it's still a blast to play. It's just $20, or as part of Game Pass, it's a no-brainer. Even if the story didn't hook me or the parry mechanic got a bit overcooked, the sheer adrenaline, the music, the chaos, it's hard not to enjoy what this game throws at you. So yeah, if you love Doom, play it, you'll find something to rip and tear into. Like and sub for more honest reviews. Thanks for watching.